Well, welcome to the show, man. I really appreciate it. I think it's like what I call a hot start. We're just going to hot start this thing and roll
Love
right
it.
into it. Man, I've been following you guys for a long time. So the way that I've kind of got turned on to your show was not through Rogan, actually, which when you guys were on the show, I was super excited to see you guys specifically on Rogan. Because I can't remember. I think anybody that kind of dabbles, that likes to kind of watch, we'll say less partisan media, is probably run across you guys and I'm referring to Crystal and Saagar, obviously. But then you being the conservative side of the voice, the majority of the time, what I like to call the logical center, actually now. I love the way that you frame up information. I think last week or 2 weeks ago, whenever I reached out, I can really say I can appreciate it when people take the military industrial complex and when they hold them to task. I really appreciate that. So welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me on Free Range American. We got a few things that I absolutely want to talk about, but my first question out of the gate is, You said something on a show a while back, and you said the reason I got into this was because of the Iraq War. And is that just journalism in general? Is that what you're referring to?
It's actually more politics, man. And
Really?
Thank you for the kind words. Like all of that being said. Yeah. So I grew up in this place in College Station, Texas, which is a really interesting, like unique place because it's literally where the library is for George H.W. Bush. So like and W was our governor. And so It's like, if you were going to find a place where it was basically heresy to say like, no, this is wrong, like this would be it. I've always been like naturally rebellious and all of that. And so around 2003, the war drum was starting to beat. And look, I was young. I'm talking about like, I was like 12 or 13 years old. And I would just be, I'd be the annoying kid in class and I would raise my hand and be like, yeah, but like, does he have nuclear weapons, right? And it'd be like, well, it's in the news, right? It's in the New York Times. And it just stuck with me so hard because, 6 months into the war, September 2004, it's all bullshit and we all know it. And it was one of these things, it's just got memory hold in the discourse. And it made me so angry because I had neighbors in College Station who were actually deployed. I knew people who had signed up for the military after 9/11 and wanted to go and avenge what happened. I mean, obviously, it's a noble and important thing. And I just got angrier and angrier that we had been led into this war under complete lies. And just that was a very radicalizing experience personally. And that's why I got involved in politics. And then the 2004 election happened. And again, I was just a teenager and I was like raging against the machine. And you see, I mean, he won, like Bush won. And I was like, I was like, what do you have to do in this country? And I think that's really where I became obsessed with the foreign policy and with the military. And I heard stories actually from people who had gone, and this is around when I was like 18 or so, people who were my age or a little bit older who came back and they were like, man, like my officers didn't know what we were doing. And like my friends got killed or like my friends ended up in a bad situation. And again, it just made me so angry because I'm not blaming the officers. I think they were playing.
Sure.
If you're a National Guardsman and you get called up to go and become like, you become a guy who's trying to intermediate Shia-Sunni relations in the middle of Fallujah. I mean, that's not, I don't blame you. Like, that's not on you. That's on your leaders that sent you there. And it really made me, and it put at home the magnitude of the failures of conventional wisdom. And nobody here pays a price. Like I have walked past Scooter Libby and Paul Wolfowitz and Donald Rumsfeld. I ran into him on the street once. And these guys are living large and they're making a lot of money. And I'm like, you don't know what you did. Like, do you know what you did to so many people? Even today, it just burns white hot whenever I see that. So that really is like what forged me in politics.
Well, it's interesting. And that's kind of one of the things I wanted to move with you in this conversation, which is why is it in obviously this is a very complex question. Why is it that our leadership can never pay the price for poor decision making. And sometimes we'll say corrupt and incompetent decision making, because as a guy that runs a company, if somebody makes a grossly incompetent mistake, they're terminated, they're fired, right?
Yeah.
So is there a reason, do you think, that outside of there's just a kind of a lack of coherent understanding as to what actually defines competence? Or do you think it's deeper than that?
So it's a really interesting question. And look, nobody makes it here because they're dumb. Mm-hmm. Anybody who makes it to the top is very smart. And one of the things that you realize, you mentioned running a company. You can't fire everybody though, can you, Evan? And so that's the question. Right. So if everybody becomes complicit within a decision, or more importantly, you control the pipeline through which everybody becomes a member of your company, then what are you going to do? I mean, you're going to go against the grain of not just your deputy, but your deputy's deputy and your deputy's deputy. And one of the things that the chief ideologues behind the war in Iraq and the current, in terms of the permanent occupation of Afghanistan, have been very adept at, is that they not only were the ones who pushed forward something very much on the edge, they made everybody complicit. The CIA, the State Department, Colin Powell, famously. Like they basically put blood and dirt on everybody's hands, so that if the time does come for, so let's hold someone to account, there's too many people at that point, and there's too many people bought into a system. And then what's even worse is that is a disincentive for people speaking out. Because if you speak out, then you're kicked out of kind of the complex. As in, for example, like if people need to remember what 2003 was like. If you were here in Washington and you spoke out against the Iraq war, ostracized. I've actually spoken to people who that happened to early in the war. Nobody in the Bush administration would talk to them. Their access was cut completely. That's if what you do is, and I think about a lot, is you construct a system in which it is very difficult to go against the grain. And the rewards, everybody likes to think they would speak out. And the truth is, like, you probably wouldn't. And it's not even necessarily that I blame you. It's like, you need a job, you need health insurance, you got to pay for your kid's thing. And you sit there and maybe you have doubts, but you don't say anything. And then the president is like, hey man, I need you to go out and take point on this. And you do it. And then you leave office. And now it's on you, so you have to defend it. It's a very vicious cycle, but that's largely, I want to explain just like how complex it becomes whenever it's a systemic indictment is really what we're talking about.
Yeah, and from a guy that was obviously participating in the war. So I was part of the invasion of Iraq, and the lead up to Iraq as a guy in the military. What we were seeing and what we were hearing was there's weapons of mass destruction. These people are supporting terrorists. It's a wide variety of information that we were ultimately going to pursue and then end in that pursuit. There was a counter narrative out there. There was. That counter narrative never really was kind of mined and then pushed out into the public. And I think journalism just in general during that time, I don't think that there was an active pursuit of truth. And I don't think that, and that leads me into such a fucking complex piece of information here, which is, as a guy that was on the ground participating in the war, I was committed to violence and committed to dying for in the act of war for, we'll call it, patriating a group of people that were under the thumb of a dictator, and that dictator was supporting international terrorist organizations, and they were building weapons of mass destruction that were ultimately going to come back to the United States. So, from my perspective, as a guy in 2003, and I'm taking you back to my frame of mind, was I'm ready to die for this because this is what we need to do. And participating in the war itself was something that I was very proud of in 2003. There was a counter narrative, believe it or not. There was a counter narrative. And I got in arguments and debates with people in 2004, 2005, especially across the United States. If I'd be at cocktail parties and people would be coming at me like, I can't believe you'd participate in this. I'm like, what are you talking about? The guy's, he's Saddam Hussein was a bad guy, right? There's no doubt about that. Now, it took me years, and I had 4.5 years on the ground in Iraq. Like 4.5 years of participating both as a military guy and in the CIA. I left, so I opened that country up in 2003, and I was in every major city, and I participated in, we'll call it warfare in every major city in Iraq. And I left on the SOFA. So a month after SOFA is when I left the country. I had 4.5 years on the ground there. By the time that I left, I was so jaded as to what we were doing and what I was participating in, because from my perspective, we were in and this is just Evan, right? I'm not the brightest bulb in the set here, but from the time that I left, what it felt to me like, I was participating in the transference of wealth from the American taxpayer to the military industrial complex. And then what it felt like to me was there was going to be a generation of transferring of wealth. And that's not me. What I'm saying to that is I wasn't reading a lot of Noam Chomsky at the time, right? This was me participating in the war, and I could feel it. I would go to places and I would have fields of these huge generators that were like $500,000 a piece. And I remember having this like really clear and concise click. I was down in a city called Basra, Iraq, and it was right on this river called
al-Sadr. A lot of oil fields there, right?
Yeah. And there was a field of generators that were roughly $500,000 a piece, a field of them, and they were just left. We completed the build on a base. 2 weeks later, we were completing the build, and we were also decommissioning it at the same time because of the way that the funding was overlapping, and there wasn't a way to actually take away the funding without completing the build. And then you would have to go straight into deconstruction, which was basically the removal of all the sensitive information, and then you'd destroy what you had built. Those were happening at the same time. We were building and destroying at the same time. And I couldn't believe my eyes. And I couldn't believe, I sat there and I thought to myself, am I the only person that sees this so fucked up? And I felt like I was. I felt like I was the only person looking around at going, like, do you guys not see how messed up this is? Like we're bringing in contractors and completing things, and then the next crew the next day is destroying it. Like, do you guys not see what's going on? But there is no question to that other than, man, I had 4.5 years to make this determination. I wish I would have listened to myself a little bit sooner. From the outsider's perspective, and really the question I want to ask is, do you think that was solely driven on ideology? Do you think it's a combination of kind of ideology and profit? Do you think that those two things were balanced well? And do you think maybe those guys like Cheney really did just, they believed in what they were doing so much that they were willing to do?
It's a great question, Evan, because what you identified there was, it took me a long time too. I think it takes everybody a long time in order to let these realities seep in. And this is where propaganda comes into play, where many people have no idea what you're just talking about. They have no idea about the immense amount of waste. I mean, I'll tell a story in a bit about how I was truly radicalized on Afghanistan. And this is what happened to, I think, the entire country, which is that, again, let's put ourselves back in the minds of 2003, where we are this great nation, post-peace dividend. We won the Gulf War. We won the Cold War. I mean, nobody can hold like anything to our military. And living in that decade of that massive growth, the GDP of the 1990s, where our biggest problem was that Bill Clinton got a blowjob, and then 9/11 comes and it hits us in the face, and we're ready to respond with ferocity. This is where, and some of the more conspiratorial-minded folks get mad at me, I don't believe in direct conspiracy. Like, I don't believe that Dick Cheney, the former CEO of Halliburton, invaded Iraq in order to enrich Halliburton. Here's how I think it happened. I think he was a true ideologue. And there's a book that I recommend people read called Rise of the Vulcans, which is detailing exactly what I'm talking about. A heavily committed group of neoconservatives, truly radicalized by Ronald Reagan. And I'm not blaming Reagan. What his response was fine in 1980. That doesn't mean it carries over to 2001. But we're true believers in the spreading of democracy, in the United States must be the world's policeman. And it was a hubris, which I believe comes from a deep lack of familiarity with the horrors of war. And it's something, I don't have to explain it to you. I've never personally experienced it. I like to think that I have enough respect for what it means to send people into war that I don't think we just had as a nation for so long. The worst thing that happened previously to that was Black Hawk Down, right? And even that was like a huge thing. And we, even after 2003, I think it took 4 or 5 years to set into the public consciousness. Around the time of the surge, we were losing like 120 guys a day. And you're like, hey, I know that guy. Or like, hey, like my cousin came back and he doesn't have a leg anymore. Or like, hey, like my friend's friend came back and like he's addicted to pills. Like it took a long time to seep into the public consciousness. So that's a long way of saying is I think they were committed to it ideologically and that there were a variety of factors at play as to why. What I will not forgive is by 2005, we knew what was up. And that's when the lies truly, that was when the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. That was what insurgency? What are you talking about? That was everything we did was right. This is Biden. This was Bush. This was everybody who was involved in the foreign policy consensus refused to discuss the insurgency or listen to people like you who were on the ground and coming back and being like, yo, we're going outside the wire. And at night, this place is going to shit. Thousands of Iraqis dying every month and all that. I can't forgive that. I can't forgive the people after that point. And this is where it really just makes me so upset just thinking about how many lives were lost and for what. And you look at Iraq even right now, which is moderately more successful than Afghanistan. And you say, come on, what was it all for?
I think that's what, as a guy that participated in both Iraq and Afghanistan, because I went to Afghanistan in 2009, right after SOFA. So what I tell people is like, listen, I'm a recovering, I would say like uber zealot, right? Just like I was ready to go. And for, a decade plus, I was ready to go because I believed in what we were doing. I think there's what I've kind of turned the corner with and what I saw in Iraq specifically was exactly right. I saw what I felt on the ground and the people that I had talked to, whether they were Iraqis or non-Iraqis or whomever was on the ground, like participating in this actual event. But the majority of the civilians, all of us came to the same conclusion, by the way. The civilians wanted the same things that most civilians here in the United States wanted. They wanted the ability to feed their families, educate, and live relatively free lives. That's what they wanted. They didn't want to participate in radical religion or radical ideology. They just wanted to kind of go about their days and live relatively free and participate in kind of just evolution, right? Yeah. And 2005, and I remember specifically in 2003 when they said a de-Baathification was required. And I go back to this and I remember the day I was in the team room and I was watching the news. That's actually how we found out. And we were working directly with the CIA and special forces, the de-Baathification, was we all took a deep breath and we were like, these guys are trying to create an insurgency. This is the dumbest fucking thing they could ever do. Send everybody home that has guns and say you're not going to get paid. And oh, by the way, you're now criminals. Like, what the fuck are you guys doing? And we all sat there in the team room watching the news going, oh my God, what is going on? Because we knew all these guys on the streets. I was in Najaf at the time. So on Najaf was this, it's a huge population base. It's actually more of the Iranian religious center because of the Grand Mosque of Imam. And So we had just left a riot where the cleric we were trying to install there was actually murdered by a guy named Muqtada al-Sadr, and you'll remember that name.
I do. I remember. Well, yeah.
So believe it or not, this is like fucking history, like Evan the coffee guy. So I participated in the first American meeting with Muqtada al-Sadr back in 2003. So my ODA facilitated the first meeting with that scumbag. And we left there going, this guy is going to be a problem. He's never going to work for us. Mm-hmm. We're never going to be able to turn this guy to work for us. He is going to be a problem. And you know what the agency came back and said?
What?
You guys don't know what you're talking about. No shit. That's what they came back and said. Because the guy on the ground that was running that guy was a career academic that studied like Middle Eastern policy from George Washington. He was an analyst and he'd never actually run an asset to that level, but they were so shorthanded and they were trying to, do too much too fast. And so you had, the agency and the State Department trying to work with Muqtada al-Sadr. You had, SF guys, because I was a Green Beret at the time, and we're like, this guy needs to probably end his existence here on this planet just relatively soon, or we got to figure this out. And we sat there in the team room and we were laughing at the agency going, you guys are literally smoking crack if you think this guy is going to be flipped and you're going to be able to work with him. He is completely run by Iran. I mean, we're knuckle draggers, right? We know nothing. But the first 2 years, the point of this conversation is not to tell you how cool I am. It's the first 2 years of that, we couldn't believe what they were doing because it felt like everything they were doing was scripted to create an insurgency.
Yes.
You couldn't have written a better playbook to create an insurgency. And it took me another few years to go, did they try actively to create this so they could just spend more of the taxpayer dollars? I'm not sure.
I know. I know. I remember reading when I was in high school, Tom Ricks. This is another book that really, in terms of the red pill on Iraq, it was called Fiasco. And it's exactly what you're talking about, which is that it's like, look, the invasion of Iraq was probably always going to be bad with 150,000 troops, but it didn't have to turn into an outright fiasco and to a sectarian civil war. And that's exactly what you discussed. De-Baathification is right up there. The empowering of Maliki, like a little bit later on, was definitely up there. And then the Obama administration, kind of the way that they handled it, all of that. There was just it was like misstep after misstep after misstep after misstep. And that's what I mean, really, when I talk about the forgiveness, which is, I guess, like I still think the invasion is unforgivable, but I think that the lack of steps taken to seriously assess, what is going on right now? And the lack of honesty that was allowed in senior level meetings with the president by Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, that is what created what you're talking about. That is what created, literal like sectarian genocide on side. At some point, U.S. troops are like sitting there building up walls between different neighborhoods to stop people from killing each other by like drilling knives into their skulls. During screws or what. And this is what I'm talking about though, which is I don't think Americans ever really knew what was going on. They knew it was a shit show. They were like, oh, this is a shit show. They don't know like the series of steps that were made by our idiot leadership class that led to an outbreak of a civil war. And like the empowerment of Al-Qaeda and Iran. I mean, you want to talk about what made Iran powerful? It was us. We paid them. And then we paid them to kill our soldiers with their, sophisticated IEDs. And it's just like, I go down, I'm really living in memory lane here because I don't get to talk about this as much, but this is why I guess they get so angry at the establishment and at the media in particular too, because they look at this stuff as a game. Like if invading Iraq had been like, for example, around Trump, like whenever Trump would talk about Iraq and Afghanistan, you'd find some, grubby guy who had his hands deep into not only defense contracts, but had played a central role in invading the countries in the first place, to give a quote in the New York Times about why Trump was wrong. And I'm like, are you people out of your mind? Like, look, Trump can be bad. But this guy is so much worse. And I'm like, let's just realize we're the true villains in our society. Yeah. And they're rich. They're filthy rich, really man. Rich. They live right here. Yeah.
Well, that's the thing that I've talked about a lot on the podcast, and you said it. You said the idiot leadership class. And I guess the thing that I want to transition to now is, when we look at these mistakes, and they're blatant mistakes in modern history that you and I have both lived through, and the two of us together, we're not building rocket ships, right? We're just like a guy that runs a coffee company, and I'm not devaluing what you do. I'm just saying, like,
no, please,
we're not solving cancer.
Yeah.
Like, we're doing what we do for a combination of reasons, but we can see that, and I can see right through it in the idiot leadership class, which this is not going to turn into, a Hannity rant. What I'm saying is like, why are people willing to forfeit their liberty to a group of imbeciles that have continued to let us down time after time after time in modern history? We felt these things. We understand them. Now, is it complacency in the media? Is it a cabal, a conspiracy cabal where the Illuminati is I don't know, man. Like, give me your 2 cents on that.
It's very difficult because, again, I have to turn to systems. Our systems are designed in very bad ways.
Right.
And so on 3 different levels. So first of all, on our partisan production process, which is that right now with our current system, you can see actually in the last 15 years that the greatest threat to an incumbent member of Congress is from an intra-party challenge, as in not being too ideologically right or not being too ideologically left enough, which causes people to drift further away from a center and grab onto and make sure that they go scorched earth against each other's policies. That's number 1 in terms of Congress. Number 2 is elite production. And I'll give you an example, because this is honestly, frankly, I think even more important, which is that what produces the CIA asshole that you had to deal with, who thought he knew better than you? Well, it's the educational pipeline. And so I had the, great privilege actually of you hear how I talk. I'm pretty confrontational. I'm pretty anti-conventional wisdom. And so I actually got my master's from Georgetown in security studies, where I was going at it daily, basically in my classes with members of the military. I mean, these guys they're all officers, and they're all doing this class, this program, because they want to be on the general track.
Right.
And I think the type who, doing the Georgetown thing, very bought into the military can do no wrong. We actually won the Iraq war. You don't know what you're talking about.
Right.
What are you civilian? They would try and pull that stuff. And I was like, that's fine. we're not arguing battlefield tactics like we're arguing strategy. But really what it was is I got to see very firsthand what creates our future State Department foreign officers, what creates our next generation of bureaucrats. And they are imbibed with a couple of things. And just first of all is the sheer narcissism of the idea that, like, it's difficult to describe, but it's very neoconservative in its idea of, like, we can import democracy to Afghanistan. Or like, for example, I recently saw this story, which I think just encapsulates it, which is General Miley. He's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Right.
I mean, he broke down in tears in the Situation Room because he was like, we can't leave Afghanistan because of women's rights in the country. Do
you think he really did that?
I do. I believe
that.
It.
You think so?
I believe it.
Okay.
I believe it 100%.
I read that and I was like, this is total bullshit. There's no way.
Because I know how these people think. I really do. Like, I sat in the room with the future General Mileys and the future Foreign Service officers and the future Colin Powells and State Department people. And I would argue very basic precepts with them. And another thing that made people very uncomfortable is, I'll take H.R. McMaster, for example. H.R. McMaster is the definition of the, scholar general. Like, he got his PhD and all of this. And he was held up by a lot of people in Washington, some people who I used to respect. And then he became the national security advisor. And I know this for a fact. In the Situation Room, he pitched Trump on putting 70,000 more troops in Afghanistan in the year 2017. And I said in one of my classes, this was kind of before that and all that. And I was like, I believe that those types of people should be fired and should be shunned, like they should be shunned for going against the democratic will. All of this is a long way of saying is that the biggest problem we have is we have an elite class that believes that they know better than you or I and the average citizen. When the truth is it's the exact opposite. We have elected 3 separate presidents in a row to get out of Afghanistan, and we just won't do it. And the reason why is because there's this paternalistic instinct within the minds of especially foreign policy elite saying they don't know what's going to happen. This could lead to this or this could lead to that. I actually think people know much better. And it's a very anti-democratic mindset that a lot of people have in DC, especially in the foreign policy realm, of these sheep will go along and more. And look, unfortunately, that is true for some things, and especially in some limited capacities. But Americans wise up, and they almost always come to the proper answer.
How are we looking up there, Sergeant Best? On target, on time, boys! Fire for effect! Here we go! Set! You heard him! Fire for effect!
But they won't listen. And I think that's the biggest problem we have.
Well, I completely agree, by the way. And I love having people on the show that completely agree with me because it's great. No, because you're much better articulating some of these things than I am, where I'm trying to figure out how do we hold people accountable. And when I say that, it's like when I see mainstream media, and I don't believe they're actually asking the right questions or holding people accountable and doing their job. I really don't. Because when we look at, we'll say the minimum success criteria for Afghanistan, there's not a person. I think you could go to Washington and you could go to every one of the State Department officials and CIA guys and say, what are the minimum success criteria for what you're trying to accomplish, or America as a country, our minimum success criteria for our strategic goals in Afghanistan? And you're going to have 20 different answers, 30 different answers. Right. You're going to have people that don't understand. You're going to be like, what are you talking about? We're there. Well, that's the success criteria.
Right.
To me, that's a fundamental problem and a lack of leadership and coherent leadership from the top. And holding your leadership accountable, whether it's through voting or whether it's through legal action, whatever that might be, that's kind of the whole thing of being an active participant or a citizen of the United States. But the thing that I want to ask you is, why is the media so complacent in this? What's going on to the point where are they all in this together? Are they just so kind of like blithely incoherent and self-absorbed that they can't understand what's going on? From your assessment, why is the mainstream media so complacent when it comes to these things?
It's because this goes to the systemic production of I was a White House correspondent, so I can actually I can answer this pretty authoritatively, which is that the way to be a White House correspondent is you write these bullshit political articles every single day by sitting on the campaign bus. You hope that the person that you're covering wins. And by bullshit, I mean the stuff like so-and-so responded to this attack, or so-and-so trashes so-and-so, truly low IQ stuff, which is just very much these are people who are I like politics, but they don't actually like policy. So they don't actually know anything about the policy itself. And so what you get used to is asking and generating news and questions, which are very much more geared towards what your peers will like, number one, and number two, which is how to get ratings or clicks. And look, it's not sexy to ask about Afghanistan or Iraq or any of these things. And here's the other problem. It requires knowledge. which is that I would see this all the time whenever it came to North Korea. People were like, oh, I mean, why is President Trump meeting with dictator Kim Jong-un? I'm like, do you know anything about our 20-year history of dealing with the Kim regime and nuclear weapons? No, you don't know anything. Like, you don't know, you don't even know when North Korea got a nuke. Same thing with Putin or Crimea and Ukraine. Everything becomes hyper politicized in the Washington context. And the problem is very, very, very few people in the press are ever incentivized to ask or think about questions in a different context. And so the problem is two things. The peers among them they all understand, from the oldest ones to the youngest, that the youngest ones want to become the oldest ones, right? Like, they want to get on TV. The easiest way to get on TV is, when you're young, is to ask like a provocative question and get into a fight with Sarah Sanders about the Mueller report. So you're just responding to incentives. And then people lean into those incentives because they like to make money. And also, being on TV is pretty fun. Like, people recognize you and all of that. And so all of what I'm describing is a system of incentives from the top and the bottom, in which it encourages people to ask very vacuous questions and not know very much about what they're talking about. And that leads to this situation that we have right now, where you have like the total gamification of the press, where everything that you ask in the briefing room or in an interview with the president is geared towards making headlines, not just today, but right now, getting retweets on Twitter. And so what they're doing is they're performing for each other, but they're not performing for you. And that's actually one of the worst things, is that we used to have a system where, like, the Kansas City Star would have a Washington correspondent. Right. And that person would cover Missouri-related news. Or, I'm from Texas. Like, we would have the Austin, I forget what the Austin paper is, whatever. It's Austin American Statesman or the Dallas Morning News or any of those. They would have Washington correspondents, and they would focus on the congressman, on the issues that would actually affect Texas. And they may even cover the White House and ask a question like that. But with the concentration of all media in New York, DC, and LA, and San Francisco, you basically have it so that people all live in the single area. They only know one another. They have no real connection to the outside, nor do they want one, because that's not where they make their money. And they're not incentivized at all to ask the questions that you and I are talking about right here. I could count on maybe one hand the number of people I know who cover the White House, who've even been to Afghanistan or Iraq, or who used to cover the Pentagon. They're almost always the same cut of political reporters who know actually nothing about policy. And it's a huge problem.
And it appears to me that it to your point, it's getting worse. Like, it's picking up velocity, worse. Yeah. And we're at a race to the bottom, specifically related to mainstream media and information related to mainstream media. And then when you get into independent media, now you have a mixed bag, right? So, wow, right? Like, obviously, you're on YouTube. You understand kind of the mixed bag. You've got the flat earther crowd on one side, right? And then you have fairly educated people, and then you have like the people in the middle that sound semi-coherent, but they might be schizophrenic too. I'm not sure, but wow, is so chopping through the information to really get something that doesn't just validate your worldview, but might be kind of a look at both sides, which leads me to my next piece, which is like, how did you and kind of, and I've heard it before on the show, but I think it'd be interesting for people to kind of dive into it. How did you make that transition from what you were doing into what you're doing now? And why? Like, what was your off ramp, man?
I hated the system. I hated being a White House correspondent. I hated being stuck in the daily news cycle. And I thought that enough people craved what I craved, which was something different. And so I had the opportunity with Crystal to kind of redesign like the whole show. We kind of start off from the beginning, and both of us had a very similar shared critique of the American establishment. And it caught on, and it caught on enough that nobody could really say anything, right? Like, it caught on to the point where it became so successful that it became very clear that there were millions of people who wanted to listen. And I think it's important for people to know nobody in their right mind in DC media told me that I should do what I did. Everybody said, don't do it, man. They're like, what are you doing over there? Like, you think anybody cares what you have to think? Or they're like, I don't know, YouTube, like who's even on? It's a narcissism, right? Like it's crazy because we live in a town where getting on CNN for 3 minutes, I'll give you an example. Like Tucker Carlson is my old boss. I do his show. He's the only cable news show that I will do.
Right.
I do like 3 minutes on Tucker, and more people around town were like, oh my God, I saw what you had to say. Like, to them, cable is the only medium that matters, like CNN, MSNBC, Fox.
Right.
Whereas I think for most people, especially people my age, they don't watch cable. And cable is terrible. I hate doing it. I'm probably, frankly, going to get to a point where I just refuse to do it, period, because I hate it. Like, I hate doing it. It's very low IQ. It's not a way in order to impart smart information or nuanced pieces of information to people, which is what I believe is sorely lacking for the average citizen. And so I just think what, for me, is what I was and will always be different, I think, than a lot of the people who came up in journalism, because I always cared about the issues first. Like you and I were talking about Iraq. Like, I really did care about Iraq. I actually cared about Afghanistan, and I care deeply about like what happens in our economy to people who don't have a voice, like in Washington, who have been forgotten for a really long time. And one of the things I appreciated most about Trump is that he was just like a living symbol of just like a middle finger to these people, being like, no, like for many people, they voted for him because they said, I exist. Like, you need to see me. Right. You have to see me and my way of life. Like, I am American too. And I thought that was important. And it's something that nobody here still will treat with compassion. And it really bothers me because, and look, also maybe this happens because I'm from Texas. I grew up with many people who would not necessarily fit in with mainstream culture. And I think that's fine. And I think people should be able to live generally the way they want to live. And there's a deep narcissism here within the Northeastern and San Francisco like elite amongst people who really believe they know better than others. And they want you to live a certain way and talk a certain way and indoctrinate your kids a certain way. And I just think it's so deeply wrong. And so that's kind of what I wanted to exit out of. And so I just wanted to be able to like say what I really think, because here's the truth. Like, half the people in DC know this is all bullshit, but they're all, and they'll tell you that. They will tell you that over a drink. They'll be like, oh, fuck him or fuck that. And people at CNN are like, screw Jim Acosta. After they've had like a couple drinks, ask them to say it out loud. They'll never say it ever.
Right.
And I wanted to just have a place where I could be like, actually, like, screw Jim Acosta.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's all it was.
When you started this, so the transition, we'll say. So did you guys build the entire channel is this like the entire thing is The Hill? Yeah. The Hill YouTube channel at that time, it was moribund and only had 6,000 subs. And right now I think it's got like 1.2 million, something like that. So it effectively was built entirely by us. Wow. That's one. You're stepping off into the abyss, right? You're kind of like making your own mark. You're sticking off. You don't know, which I can honestly say that's commendable too. How does that break down? So I've looked at the channel itself, and this is going to sound like such a stupid question, but how do you break the information down on the Hill? So when you guys look at your buckets of information as far as your publishing schedule, how are you determining what's news and what isn't, and who does what? How many people are over there?
So it's a team. I'm not actually sure entirely how. Okay. So we have I'll just count it off. So Crystal and I, obviously, and then we have 2 guys who are in this, who operate the camera and a teleprompter, and then a director, and then 2 production staff who help with like booking and all of that.
Right.
And then a video editor. So I'm not sure how many people that is, but that's
sure.
Generally what it is. But look, I mean, honestly, Crystal and I basically do everything. Like we write all of our stuff. We book all of the guests, like maybe not physically, like, arranging schedule, like being like, come on at 2:35 PM, but we're like this guest, that guest. We pick all the topics. We write each of our radars. every single day. And like, it's a lot of work, I think people don't realize that it's a lot of work. Like you're picking all these topics and making sure what people want to know, you have to balance of like, these is something I think is really important.
Right.
And figuring out a way to convey that to people, because I like to meet people where they are. I don't want to talk down to people. Like I like to meet people where they are. And I try really hard because I realize how caught up in your own bullshit this DC can be to try and distill and dumb down things. For example, like when you were talking about SOFA, my instinct, I was like, oh, we need to explain what that is. Status of forces agreement, right? Like I got to make sure that, because I know, like you and I are talking, I know what the SOFA is and you do too. People can get very caught up in that stuff. And I try to look out for my audience who are going about their lives. What I always tell them is I'm like, I don't blame you. You don't need to know this. Like it's my job. Like I'll take it and I'll explain it to you. Because one of the great tricks that the expertise class has figured out is if you speak in enough jargon and if you make things super hard to understand, then you can get away with a lot, right?
Right.
And if you make things very inaccessible, then you don't start to become accountable to the people because people will tune out. And so I kind of view myself as an interlocutor between that.
So shifting back to politics, which is, I had this question and then I bounced onto your YouTube channel, but the Trump administration, do you think they got and I already have my opinion, but do you think that they got a fair shake from the beginning of the administration all the way through? And then obviously I'll have another question to follow that up. If not, like why? Meaning from the media and things like that. So what went wrong from the jump and what went right, do you think?
Yeah, I want to be careful about how I answer this. So obviously the answer is no. No. Any anti-establishment administration, left or right, and there hasn't been an anti-establishment left one that has come in yet, but it would face the same barriers that Trump did. That being said, this is kind of like what I said about Iraq, which is Iraq was probably always going to go bad. Like, yes, they're always going to be biased against you. I mean, he staffed it terribly. He did not pick people who agreed with him whatsoever. He picked many people who actively actually disagreed with his agenda. Many of his problems were self-inflicted. And at the end of the day, like Trump didn't actually just care that much about getting stuff done. And I know that can be hard for people who supported him to hear. I can tell you this. I interviewed Trump 4 times. I spent a total of 2 hours or so with him in the Oval Office. He's an extraordinarily impulsive and dynamic man, but he's not really that interested in governance. And the way I describe DC, and if you want to be a great president, this is what you have to do, which is that DC, if you do not have a hyper intentional view about how to fix something, then the default will become your policy. So for example, if you don't have a hyper intentional view about how we should conduct our policy towards Belarus, for example, right? Something nobody thinks about, then whatever the last 3 administrations will have done, that will be your policy.
Got it.
So if you want to change something, you got to know, I'm the president of the United States. I don't have time to worry about fucking Belarus. And neither does my Secretary of State. So I got to pick a guy who's a Secretary of State, who's going to pick a guy who's going to pick a guy who knows he's going to intuit what I want done about Belarus. That's how you be a great president. You have to pick the right people. Very few presidents have ever understood this. Reagan was one, FDR was one, LBJ was one, and Lincoln. Those people understood governments and they understood how to convey their will through the actions of their subordinates who would pick better subordinates. Trump didn't do any of that. And he actually did the opposite, picked people like H.R. McMaster, Gary Cohn, Larry Kudlow, many of others who dramatically undermined his agenda in favor of their own and in favor of, frankly, the business interests that they'd been intermingled within for a long time. And it really destroyed his administration from something that could have been transformative. And it basically happened on day one with Jared Kushner. And there's a lot that goes into that. But this is a way I think that people need to think about politics, which, look, if you're on the right, you will never get a fair shake from the media. And I tell people that all the time. That's just how it is. It's not going to change. Bitching about it, not going to fix anything. So what you have to do is come in with the assumption of you're not going to get a fair shake and pick the right people and do the best possible work you can, knowing that you will be unfairly smeared and that the deep state, whoever will push back against you. It's your job to figure out how to overcome that. Again, I didn't say it was fair, but that's life,
Well, and that's interesting because you touched on a few different things, which is the deep state, right? Well, like a lot of people have asked me this, and I've talked about the deep state. You've talked about it. So define deep state for everybody, because I think you have an interesting definition of this.
The deep state to me are people who work within the government, largely within the civil service, who have an ideological commitment to the way that American policy should go. So the perfect example I always use is Alexander Vindman. He was the lieutenant colonel who was the whistleblower during the Ukraine scandal.
Right.
And I'm not going after him. This isn't a partisan thing.
Sure.
This is actually what galled me is when he was testifying before Congress, what he said was the reason that he whistleblew on Trump during the Ukraine phone call was the president departed from the policy of the United States.
Right.
And that really bothered me because I said, no offense, but who the fuck are you? Like the president of the United States makes American foreign policy.
Yeah.
He was duly elected by the American people. And if he wants to do something with Ukraine, that's on him. And it's not on you to say, this is the policy of the United States. The policy is whatever the president says it is. And that was just a very good window into the mindset of people in the State Department, in the CIA, in the DOD, who, if you are to, Afghanistan's a perfect example. It is the policy of the United States that America should be committed to women's rights empowerment in Afghanistan. Sure. Really? When? Did we vote on it? And what if I disagree and I'm the president? Am I differing from the policy, or are you simply enacting something which you've been committed to in the past? So that is what I think a good example of deep state behavior looks like in its most extreme, which is here are a set of principles that we adhere to regardless of who is democratically elected. And that's why it's very dangerous.
Well, it's interesting because it seems almost a battle of wills between the government and bureaucrats and their elected officials ultimately, right? So I actually brought this out. So this is, have you ever seen this before?
Yeah. I know the book. Yeah, Crystal's actually reading it right now.
Is she really?
It's a great book.
Oh,
yeah,
well, look
literally.
at that.
Yeah.
I thought I was doing something cool, but so going through this and reading about the Dulles brothers and thinking about the administrations that ultimately the brothers served, you could kind of reverse that depending on how you kind of define that. But the deep state's kind of always been around in modern history, right? And there's always been this push-pull and this battle between we'll call it the new executive office or the new administration, and then the former bureaucrats that might have a lot of different power, right? And depending on how they're applying power and whether it's domestically or internationally, there's this really complex power scale that I don't think people respect enough. I really don't think that they respect, because, and I was talking to, and this is not me name dropping, I was talking to Dan Crenshaw about this, which was, Dan gets frustrated with just general voters because at times he's saying, no, people need to understand this is really complex, that we have to kind of balance not only our policy objectives, what we believe, what our constituents want, against who actually yields power, right? So who yields power against future endeavors, thinking about strategically. This is super fucking complex. You can't just distill it and say, this is what you want.
Yes.
It's not that easy. And I think that nuance is one of the things I wanted you to weigh in on. Do you think that it's gotten better? Do you think that it's gotten worse? Do you think it's always kind of been consistently underneath the government, kind of operating like a piece of software ultimately?
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. Deep states have always existed, and they'll exist in any centralized bureaucracy. You can look at Europe and Turkey. You can look at the evolution of modern administrative states. The Imperial Germany is a good example. Or even in the United Kingdom, they have an entire joke over there about yes, minister, because the civil government are the ones who are we run the government. You people cycle in and out. You don't know what you're talking about.
Right.
So this isn't unique just to the American system. All of that being said, in terms of why we are at, I think, a crisis point, is because we have a lack of democracy, small d democracy, in the minds of these people. This is something I referenced a little bit earlier, which is that there is no small d democratic check on the mindset of the elites in America, which is that elites in America have become so dramatically disconnected and ideologically committed to certain worldviews on foreign wars abroad, on free trade, on gender ideology, on critical race theory, a lot of different things, which are dramatically out of step with the average American citizen. And they don't care. And I think that this is the difference, which is that if you were to look back on the deep states of old, they didn't have as much of pushback because, frankly, they had more democratic legitimacy. Like what happened is that I would say around 1980, I want to say, is where this all really accelerated with the total commitment to neoconservative foreign policy and neoliberal trade policy, which accelerated in the 1990s, in the 2000s, where there was a total bifurcation in the American economy and within the class system, really. And now it has just gotten to a point where the reason people want simple solutions is because they're not buying your nuance anymore. Like they don't want to hear it. They're like, I've heard it's too complicated for 20 years. I want you to get out of Afghanistan. Or like, I've heard 4 presidents in a row tell me they're going to get me funding for a job training program, and I'm still stuck here after my job got shipped to Mexico or got shipped to China. And I was promised X, Y, or Z, and it's not here. So what's going on? I think that the concentration of wealth and power, in particular, amongst a select group of the top 25 to 40% of the population, and the deepening cultural divide is largely what the problem is, which is that they just have no conception of how somebody could disagree with them. And worse, now in particular, they have contempt. They have absolute contempt for people who would disagree, who are their own citizens. They really don't look at them as their own citizens. I think that's the biggest problem that we have right now.
Do you think that yields to a possibility for a third party, or do you think that's a pipe dream?
People ask me that all the time. I just don't see it. I mean, look, we have very ossified political institutions, but that doesn't mean that things can't get better. Trump changed the Republican Party completely. He took it over. Who the hell was he? But he can't, that's actually an inspiring story if you think about it, because this like random guy just came in and destroyed the entire Republican establishment, and he won the election. Like, dude, the first time I met Trump, I was like, this is the dude from the fucking Apprentice. Like, I was like, he's the president. Right. Like, he's in the Oval Office. It's a good thing. I actually think so. It's important. And so, look, the Democratic Party has dramatically changed. Look, they were delivered the White House on the back of upper middle class white liberals. Right. That hasn't happened in a long time. Those people used to be Republicans. A bunch of working class Latinos and whites are the ones who put Trump in the White House or gave him 75 million votes in 2020. Those people all used to vote Democrat. Ohio was a battleground state. Now it's R+8. So America changes. Like that, just because the third party's not happening doesn't mean that you can't see a total takeover or change within the political parties.
Well, I've talked a lot about this as far as like my wife and I, because I look at kind of the conversation around race in America. And I think about it from the context of just my personal, sphere that I live in. And I see this elevated conversation about race, and I see it more about class than I do about race. I think this is more a conversation about your economic status, not about what your skin color is. Because I grew up in a very rural portion of Idaho, with northern Idaho being like 99% Caucasian, but I have more in common with a person that grew up below the poverty line in Georgia, an African-American descent, than a person that grew up above my economic circumstance in Seattle, Washington. Way more.
Exactly. Exactly. Yes.
And I think this, the conspiracy side of my mind obviously goes to the point of people want the working class Americans to be bifurcated. They want us to be separate. They don't want us to unify around a certain message, because we might realize that the gig is up, right? I listen and watch and respect Cornel West more than I would say a lot of, I would say even alt-right guys that are on pundits, because I can hear the passion and the commitment about what he's doing for, we'll call it the African-American community, but really he's talking about a class issue. That's why I think Bernie Sanders has a lot of resonance with a lot of different people from, we'll call it the nonpartisan sides. And Trump, for instance, when we look back even on Trump, we say, how did he get so much of, we'll call it the center vote? And I think it's because you had a ton of people, and obviously you know way more about this, but I just want to get your take on, is this conversation that is so, I would say, incendiary around race, is it more about economics, or do you think it is about race? Do you think we really have a racism problem in America more than we do about a class elitism section that is making it about race? I don't know.
Well, here's an interesting thing that media will never tell you. We actually had the least racialized election of all time in 2020, as in people did not vote according to their race, than according to their class for the first time in modern American history. So why is that? And we should think very deeply and hard about that. Is racism a problem in America? Yes, absolutely. Is it as much of a problem as class in America? I don't know. That's for all of us to decide. But what I think the biggest problem we have is we have an elite class which benefits a lot from talking and gaslighting people into thinking that race is the biggest problem we have in America. And this is why people thought I was crazy when I was freaking out about the 1619 Project at the New York Times. I saw it coming from a mile away. I knew exactly what this became. Guaranteed curriculum. It was paired up with the Pulitzer Prize, and they are now teaching it in schools. And I just thought, look, my parents are immigrants to this country, and I think it is an incredible thing that I can come here and feel deep cultural resonance with people like Ulysses S. Grant or William Sherman or LBJ or others, because I recognize in them the want and the fight for a universal value, or Lincoln or FDR or others. And I can recognize the pursuit of that within myself for what I want for my country. That's so deeply unique. And this is what people want to focus on, because it's a very convenient, I think, tool for preserving the power of a lot of people who are in the new American elite. And it's like you said, I think they don't want people to know that the jig is up, which is that, hey, like, why is Shell Gas very comfortable sponsoring events with the Nicole Hannah-Jones' 1619 Project? They know it is not a threat to their economic livelihood. And the more people think that the chief dividing line that we have in America today is race and it's not class, then that actually protects a lot of people at the highest echelons of power. I think there's a reason that Amazon puts Black Lives Matter all over its stuff. And same with Nike, and same with the richest and most powerful people in this country. And it's because they know that it's not a threat to them. And if it was, then they would be fighting it just as hard as Amazon is fighting their union drive, like right now. I just, like the CEO of Amazon, of consumer retail, is declaring open war on Twitter. And he's got his pronouns or whatever in his bio. I'm sure. And I'm like, I think that tells you everything you need to know about where power really resides, what narratives are convenient, what are not. And I think we have a lot more in common. You said this at the top with Iraq. I mean, what do Iraqis want? They want the same thing, right? I think most Americans generally want the same thing. Or is there a portion of our populace which is racist? Yeah. There is. Is there a portion of our populace which just wants to be left alone? Yeah. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And that's actually, I think the biggest problem that we have, which is that, look, prosperous countries don't have racism problems for a reason, because these things are all interconnected. I'm really glad what you said at the top too, because what you said about having more in common with somebody who's working class in Georgia. Friend of mine, JD Vance, he once said this, and I thought it was really poignant, which is that most people who are in the ruling class in America would rather hang out with a Parisian of their same socioeconomic status, because they would have more in common with that person
Correct.
than they would a coal miner in West Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a story deeply embedded in class. And look, I'm one of those, my parents are professors. Like I know who I am. I know where I come from. Like I've lived here for 10 years and all that. But the important point is to have people who have my background be cognizant of hold on a second. There are a lot of people in this country who think differently. That's what we have missing today.
Well, it's interesting. I think, I want to go back to, I think, Trump and what he's done with the GOP. So what does this look like as far as what does the GOP look like going forward with Trump, without Trump? Obviously it's changed completely from, we'll call it 5 years ago, right? We'll call it the pre-Trump GOP and then now Trump GOP. What does the party look like going forward? Meaning what did it look like 5 years ago? What does it look like today? And then what does it look like going forward as for who's participating in the Republican Party?
Yeah. The Republican Party right now is a fascinating story. And what it is, and Trump really did change everything, which is that it was a collection of increasingly downwardly mobile, and I don't mean this in a derogatory term, I'm talking economically, downwardly mobile people in rural parts of the country and people who are also culturally downwardly mobile. So this is very important to understand. The chief dividing line in America today is culture. And if you really want to know where that comes down to, it's this, especially if you're white. Do you have a 4-year college degree or not? If you don't, you're dramatically more likely to support Trump. The Republican Party adhere to values which are much more traditional and not buy into many of the things that you see in our media and our commanding heights of our economy.
Right.
Then if you do, then you are somebody who largely, again, this is on the law of averages, probably voted for Joe Biden. You have a very different view of what America should look like, of what our values mean, of cultural progressivism in particular, and more. And so the Republican Party doesn't have an identity around policy because they don't really stand for anything in policy. What Trump really was a cultural bulwark against left-wing liberalism. And that's what the thing is, that means all things to all people. For Cubans in Miami, it was against AOC socialism. For many working class whites, it was against trade and mass immigration from Central America. For millions of suburban people who were not college educated, it was against defund the police. So that's why he was so successful. Trump was really not ideological, like economically didn't really stand for anything. But what he served as was a way for 75 million people to say, no, I've had enough. And this is the problem that liberals have, which is that they can stand for many economic policies all they want, but culturally, they are so dramatically out of step with so much of our population that they are never going to win some of these votes back. And again, look, this is a marginal story. So even if this changes 2%, that's actually a shit ton of people and can change the entire election.
Right.
And so I do think the Republican Party has a big problem because what I think is that if you pair that cultural bulwark with a forward-thinking economic agenda, you could win not just big, but huge. Like you could win major populations. But right now, much of the party infrastructure is just sold out to big business and to a very old way of thinking and ideology, unfortunately. And Evan, I'm sorry, man. I got to go.
I'm sorry too, man.
If you don't mind.
I really appreciate your time. Where can everybody find you?
On Twitter at Saagar, Instagram, same thing. YouTube, The Hill. I also host a podcast called The Realignment. I talk about this stuff every day, all the time.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Saagar. I really appreciate all your time, man. Keep doing what you're doing. Thank you again. Go check out Saagar and Crystal on YouTube. Check him out on Twitter. Follow him. Listen to him. He's an awesome guy. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Evan. And keep making great coffee, man. I've been drinking for a long time. See you later.
Dude, I appreciate it.